Years ago, my sister surprised me with a Paul McCartney concert. As a lifelong Beatles fan, it was an amazing occasion, and he really knows how to put on a show. In between songs, he would often tell the audience little stories or make funny quips showing off that immense charm that makes him the eternal bright-eyed teenager. One of my favorite moments was when he talked about how much more popular his older songs were compared to his newer music.
We know what songs you like. We can tell from here because when we do a Beatles favorite, the place lights up. Your phones are like a galaxy of stars. Then when we do a new number, it's like a black hole. But we don't care. We're going to do them anyway.
Yeah, I'm well aware that my Paul McCartney impression sounds like someone doing a bad Ringo impression who only ever watched Yellow Submarine with broken speakers and a severe learning disability. But the point is, Paul knew the audience was really there for his old hits, but he was still going to play what he wanted. And when you're doing concerts for fun, because there's no way Paul McCartney needs the money, you can indulge yourself. This anecdote is meant to stress 2 points. The first is that it's okay for a YouTuber to make a video that won't get many views if they're enjoying what they're doing. The second is that my sister is the greatest sister who ever lived. In an earlier video, I mentioned an aunt who caused me severe trauma as a child after taking part in a hoax to convince me that I got her killed. Here's another story about her. The relationship between me and my aunt and several of my uncles was more akin to a brother and sister dynamic because of how close we were in age. So just like siblings, we would often squabble. Once, during such a verbal spat, young me called my aunt a horror, thinking about movie monsters like Frankenstein, Dracula, or the Wolfman. Notice how I pronounced the word horror just now, because this is not how younger me said it. Younger me had a more pronounced Midwestern accent, one that tends to remove syllables from certain words. The look of shock on my aunt's face being called what she heard as whore by her preschool-aged nephew made me realize I must have said something pretty bad. She was clearly thinking about something much, much different than Frankenstein, Dracula, or the Wolfman. She dragged me to my mother to complain, but after explaining what I meant, everyone calmed down. Being curious, I asked what they thought I meant. Eager to not dwell on it, my mother quickly explained that a whore was a woman who slept with a lot of men. This didn't help, because in my mind, I pictured a woman on a cot in an army barracks surrounded by a bunch of men wearing pajamas, and couldn't quite understand why this was so bad. Just be honest with your kids. It's a lot less confusing for them in the long run. Most of my uncles are awful people.
Awful people.
But one in particular was especially bad growing up. He used to bully and bruise me, probably because he was the spoiled youngest until I came along. He loved using me as a target for projectiles, especially rubber bands. If shooting rubber bands was ever made an Olympic sport, my uncle could have easily played for his country. He'd have been eventually kicked off the team for gross misconduct, but my point is he had great accuracy and would often shoot me in the face with them. Once though, he had a bottle of glass cleaner and decided for whatever reason, because he was an to spray me in the face with it. When I was a kid, ammonia was a selling point in a lot of commercials. So even though I didn't know what ammonia was, I knew that glass cleaner was filled with it. With my burning, watery eyes stinging from the blue chemicals my uncle had shot inside them, I was convinced that I had contracted pneumonia from that spray bottle because I didn't know the difference between those similar sounding words. Preschool wasn't that popular when I was that age, so for many of us, kindergarten was often our first exposure to learning numbers and letters. The teacher focused on just trying to get us to be able to spell our first names so we could sign our homework when turning it in. Homework was crayon drawings and connect the dot pages. Now, as a kid, I was generally smarter than most my age. And you might find this difficult to believe, but knowing that I was a bit more intelligent than my peers gave me just a little bit of an ego. While the rest of my class struggled with spelling their first names, not only did I master the intricacies of the 4 letters that make up Joey, but I was fairly confident that I could handle my last name as well. I knew this would blow my teacher's mind. This was all long before my mother's marriage, and my last name at the time was Barrett. B-A-R-R-E-T-T. Piece of cake, and I started writing my name as Joey Barrett on my homework. One day, my aunt, the psycho one who would later convince me I was guilty of manslaughter, saw one of my papers and suggested that I stop writing my last name because the teacher would think I was a brat. Horrified, I thought my aunt was telling me that I was being insolent and that it didn't look good for a young boy like me to put on airs of being able to handle signing not only his first name, but his last name as well. Years later, I happened upon one of my old kindergarten papers and learned that 5-year-old me thought that Barrett was spelled B-R-A-T. In the late 1970s, the ads Johnson & Johnson ran for Band-Aids included the promise that their products stayed on even when wet. As we all know, advertisers are all massive liars, but when you're still a kid, you don't yet have the built-up cynicism after decades of being lied to, so there's a time in your life when you take commercials at their word. Once after a bath, I was outraged to find that the Band-Aid applied earlier to my leg had easily washed off. I complained to my grandmother, and she suggested I write to the company because that's what old people do. They write letters. After close to 50 years, obviously there's no longer a copy of what I wrote, but I'm fairly certain it wasn't exactly polite. I believe it started with, "Dear Band-Aid, you say your Band-Aids stay on even when wet. Well, prove it." Very confrontational, but my grandmother dutifully sent it in. And to my amazement, a few weeks later, Johnson & Johnson replied, thanking me for my letter, apologizing for their inferior product, and including a sample package of their new and improved Band-Aids, guaranteed to better stay on when wet. I never felt more powerful in my life. Little 7-year-old me forced $1 million conglomerate to its knees with a firmly worded letter. I was so proud I took it to school during show and tell to impress my classmates. Like my ego wasn't big enough back then. Speaking of school, I grew up not only before the digital age, but much of my school life took place before the video age as well, and most schoolroom presentations were done via film strips or 16mm film reels. During the Thanksgiving season, teachers would invariably show us a worn-out presentation of the Pilgrims, describing their flight to America to avoid religious prosecution, their struggles to survive, and how they were saved by friendly Native Americans. These stories always included the Native Americans showing the Pilgrims the best way to plant crops, usually by burying a fish in the soil. However, none of these film strips or reels ever went much further than that. They showed Squanto dropping fish into a hole, but they skipped the part about what fertilizer is and how it helps. So for years, I thought corn grew from fish. I love chocolate. I love chocolate almost as much as my bidet. It's almost unhealthy how much I love chocolate. I hesitate to call it an addiction, but let's just say that if I don't have it in my desk drawer, I actually feel anxious, like an alcoholic nervously looking at an empty whiskey bottle. This is a lifelong obsession, and I was shameless about it as a child. If there was any chocolate in the house, I would attempt to steal it. My grandmother ran a catering business out of her home and was constantly yelling at me to stay out of her kitchen because she knew I would steal what she was planning on selling. She even went so far as to hide chocolate from me, thinking that by securing a box of it on top of the refrigerator, I wouldn't be able to reach it. The joke was on her because to a nimble 5-year-old, kitchen cabinetry was essentially just a giant climbing wall. So whenever the mood struck me and Grandma was busy in her kitchen, I would carefully ascend the cabinets until reaching the summit of Mount Fridge to enjoy a well-deserved but stolen square of chocolate. Dark, waxy, somewhat bitter chocolate that came in tiny squares that were easy to break off. Ex-Lax. It was Ex-Lax. I had been occasionally stealing chocolate-flavored laxatives. Palmolive dish soap ran an advertising campaign for years starring Madge the manicurist. Most of their television commercials followed the same pattern. Madge would be talking to her client who would complain about her hands being dry from doing dishes. Madge would suggest using Palmolive dish soap because it would soften their hands. The client would be doubtful, then Madge would utter her catchphrase, "You're soaking in it." Her client would always act surprised, and they'd cut to a scene of the woman jerking her hand out of a bowl of the dish soap. The thing is, as a kid, I had no idea what a manicurist was. I assumed it had something to do with trimming fingernails, but that was it. I certainly wouldn't know that part of most manicures involves soaking the client's fingers in a liquid, often just water with a little oil in it. Because they always acted so surprised, I thought every single one of Madge's clients were these very stupid women who sat down at a table and accidentally set their hands in a bowl of liquid and didn't notice their fingers were wet until Madge pointed it out to them. Now, to be fair, if you watched a lot of 1970s TV commercials, you'd notice that most people in them were very, very dumb. That Paul McCartney thing earlier, I did have more planned where I was dressed up in a very quickly put together Paul McCartney type outfit, but it was really cringy, so I kind of dropped that. But I will end this video with 2 quick seconds of it so you can see just how bad it was.
Then when we do a new number, it's like a black hole.
And that concludes another installment of Stupid Things I Believed as a Child. As mentioned, while these videos get little if any activity, they're fun to do, and if nothing else, my mother seems to enjoy them. So if you stayed to the end, thank you. I appreciate your view. This is my first video in my new studio with some new equipment, and I hope it turned out well. I am currently working on a few Scooby scripts, and now that I can film from home, I'm hoping my output increases. So please like this video, and if you're not currently a subscriber, it'd be pretty cool if you became one.